Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Adolf Hitler, alleged doubles of Adolf Hitler. See also Holocaust victims. See also Thule Society. See also World War II. Contact Report 036.
Adolf Hitler was a genius in many respects. His knowledge ranged from various fields of art and technology to various sciences and the use of the powers of suggestion. In his inner form, he was an incarnated life form of very good values. However, he was not a human being with a highly developed spirit, but rather a human being with values of intellect and rationality, destined to lead the entire earthly politics and economy, as well as all states, in a certain positive direction, so as to create a peaceful, united world and earth humankind. For this purpose, he was trained and incarnated at his place. He was intended to give the earth a new appearance and to initiate new forms of development through positive Gewaltsam Gewaltsamkeit, powerful actions using logic and rationality. This was strictly monitored and overseen. But ultimately, all efforts were in vain, and he was not able to fulfill his task in the form in which it was envisaged. Via the then leaders of the Thule Society and their clairvoyant Hannes and Firmrist, the Giza intelligences managed to take possession of the being of Adolf Hitler and to abuse him for their dark and malicious purposes, without him resisting it, because a delusional greed for power had flared up in him himself. In addition to this undertaking, innumerable forces in the form of human beings of Earth who had fallen prey to the Giza intelligences were regarding their consciousness manipulated and placed in his closest vicinity, whose influence he was also unable to withstand. So he was soon forced to act against his own destiny and to do things that did not correspond to his destiny.
I imagined something similar. For I could never come to terms with the fact that Hitler was supposed to have been simply a completely normal and not a power-addicted ruler. All his doings and actions, his trains of thought known to me from newspapers and radio speeches, which I followed with interest and often with Svath's help during the war, cannot be reconciled with the image that was generally made of him during the war. This was also made clear to me by Svath.
Sure, it is as you say. Adolf Hitler had succumbed to a delusion of power and was also maliciously abused by the Giza intelligences, with the old Thule Society playing a not inconsiderable part in this, which, however, cannot be transferred to the society of the same name of the new form.
Contact Report 202.
My question. As Svath once explained to me, Adolf Hitler was syphilitic and already terminally ill in the third stage, and in consciousness, he was already no longer entirely clear in the head. His consciousness had already been partially impaired, by what means he could no longer think clearly and act, and he also became megalomaniacal and unpredictable. From this disease, syphilis, he would have died sooner or later if he had not shot himself, which he actually did, right? Anyhow, that's what Svath said.
What you have said corresponds to the truth. But why do you mention these things?
Quite simply because there are always people who maintain that Hitler is still alive, and thus did not commit suicide.
That corresponds to erroneous, stupid, and know-it-all claims, as well as wishful assertions, because Adolf Hitler actually shot himself, and to be sure in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945. At that time, he was just 56 years old.
He actually was not German, but rather Austrian, son of the Austrian customs official Alois Hitler. He really became a German citizen in 1932. As Svath said, he was also a Jew, but he denied this throughout his life.
That is of correctness. He kept this secret until his suicide.
Thus, Hitler, with absolute certainty, has no longer been alive since 1945, as Schwath said.
Contact Report 260.
Then I have another question, and indeed in reference to Adolf Hitler, about whom Simyase, your daughter, once said something before. I have here the 36th contact report from Monday the 20th of October 1975. From this, I will read aloud to you what Simyase said, to whom the question was asked. At what place had Dolphy been educated, and how did the monitoring of him take place? Then, a further question relates to whether there is a significant destiny for his next incarnation. So now, here's what Simyase said, Pleiadian, Pleiaren Contact Reports Volume 1, page 460. Simyase Adolf Hitler was, in many respects, a genius. His knowledge ranged from a variety of areas of art and technology concerning a variety of sciences, up to the use of the power of suggestion. In his internal form, he was an incarnate life form of very good values. Nevertheless, he wasn't a man of highly developed spirit, but rather a man of intellect and reason, who was destined to lead the overall earthly politics and economy, as well as all nations in a certain positive direction, in order to create a peaceful, united world and earth humanity. For this purpose, he was educated and incarnated at his place. He was destined to give a new style to the earth, through a positive and enforced nonviolence, and to initiate new forms of development. This was very strictly controlled and monitored. But ultimately, all efforts were in vain, and he was unable to fulfill his task in the way that it was provided. Through the leaders of the Thule Society at that time, as well as through their clairvoyant, Hanussen Fur, the Giza intelligences succeeded in taking possession of Adolf Hitler's being and in misusing him for their dark and malicious purposes, without him being able to defend himself against them, for a delusion-related lust for power flared up inside of him. In addition to this endeavor, still innumerable forces were manipulated in the form of the Earth humans, who succumbed to the Giza intelligences in their consciousnesses, and who were placed into his closest range, whose influence he also couldn't oppose. Thus, he was soon compelled to act against his own determinations, and to do things that didn't correspond to his destiny. Billy continued. At that time, Simyase wasn't allowed to say more, she explained. But maybe it is different today, such that I might learn something more from you? You once said before that Adolf Hitler also had or just would have had the task of creating a united Earth world.
That was actually so, that is correct. The path that he then took, however, even with terror and war, was absolutely wrong, and was neither in his destiny, nor in any guidelines assigned to him, nor even in our interests. The reason for his wrongly chosen path developed quite early on, when he secretly came in contact with the Thule Society of that time, in consequence of which he also came in contact with Hermann Steinschneider, who also belonged to the Thule Society and supported its unfair goals, and who called himself the clairvoyant, Erich Jan Hanussen. Steinschneider, that is to say Hanussen, moved in all circles of major Nazi figures, among whom he had many clients, so even also Adolf Hitler, who became enslaved to him, and indeed, even before he seized the leadership for himself. Steinschneider, Hanussen, emerged as a middleman between the Thule Society and Hitler, and, so to speak, directed Adolf Hitler according to the Thule Society's leader's will. The efforts of the leaders at that time of the Thule Society went out for the acquisition of world domination. Consequently, already very early on, they allowed Steinschneider to influence and shape Hitler in this direction by what means this then began, in accordance with their will, with terror and murder, to trigger World War II in the end. At the same time, Steinschneider became ever more powerful in the course of time, with respect to his domination over Adolf Hitler, which didn't appeal to various people who were against Hitler and his machinations. The consequence of this was that they allowed Steinschneider, alias Hanussen, to be murdered in 1933, but this didn't change anything in Hitler's attitude and course. Therefore, he became more and more of a monster, as you would say. It's interesting to know that Adolf Hitler was born on 4/20/1889 in Braunau, Upper Austria, and Hermann Steinschneider, alias Erich Jan Hanussen, was born in Vienna, also in the year Thus. Both were Austrians. What is to be said further in relation to your question is that Adolf Hitler had already been instructed by our forces through telepathic impulses in his earliest youth, in terms of his determinations and guidelines, and indeed on an ongoing basis and at every place where he always stayed. Thus he was also under constant control. At the same time, he learned a lot, and everything started off very well until he went to Vienna to enjoy an artistic education, at which he then failed, however. From that point in time, he rapidly fell more and more toward the negative and evil. Consequently, he soon fell outside of our control, and our telepathic impulse attempts remained fruitless. From then on, he not only developed an unhealthy ambition, but also an uncontrollable fanaticism, as well as a hatred for all life, which he considered from his viewpoint as imperfect. From this, everything that resulted later from his thoughts and actions, and that brought millionfold misery across the earth, developed within a short time.
And how should it be understood that he, by force, should give to the earth a new style and new forms of development? You never told us any more details about it. What must we think of this?
Logical enforced nonviolence, which means in this case that he should have taken all humane possibilities into consideration in order to give weight to his destiny and to fulfill this. However, enforced nonviolence, in this sense, means that the necessary changes should be proclaimed and be implemented through weighty decrees in order to create the goal of world peace and a united earth world through a truly peaceful mission. Acts of war were never taken into consideration because these are not only unlawful against creation, inhumane and destructive, but also promoting of hatred and against all reason. Thus, if there was talk of by force, then it was only in the sense of the enforced nonviolence that should have rested in decrees and regulations that could be implemented peacefully. Nevertheless, Adolf Hitler ignored this and violated this guideline in the worst way. Consequently, immeasurable misery and millions of deaths came over the Earth humans.
And that in no way justified all his knowledge in various things.
Contact Report 385.
About Adolf Hitler, who started World War II. To this day, it is still unclear how this mass murderer killed himself. Do you know about that? It is always claimed that he poisoned himself, while others claim that he fled to Spain or South America.
These matters are all part of my knowledge. Adolf Hitler, fearing that his suicide might fail, robbed himself of his life in two ways. First, he took a cyanide capsule, which he bit and swallowed, and then he immediately put a handgun in his mouth and shot himself in the brain with it, the bullet then escaping at the side of the back of his head. His remains were secretly buried by the Russians in East Germany, where they were dug up again in 1975 and thrown away so that no neo-Nazi cult site could be established. Parts of the skull and dentures were brought to Russia, where they are still kept today.
Contact Report 463.
Once again, a question regarding Adolf Hitler. You have clearly explained to me that he committed suicide in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945 and was then burned to death. The Russians then buried his few remains left over from the cremation several times, dug them up again, and finally brought them to Moscow. In recent times, when the bone material was released for analysis, it was also possible to prove that these were really the remains of Hitler. Now, however, recently various people, such as a certain Jordan Smith, perhaps an invented name, have been claiming that Dolphy's death was only invented by the British, who only invented the story of the suicide to damage the reputation of National Socialism. This damage to the reputation, a psychological warfare, so to speak, was intended to break the will of the German people to resist the foreign occupiers.
This assertion is pure nonsense, because Adolf Hitler actually committed suicide, as my father Svath has told you at the time when the event took place, which he also observed himself, as I know from his notes.
Contact Report 520.
Hitler, who himself was partly of Jewish descent, took the false protocols and used them to fulfill his lust for power, for his criminal work, and to trigger the Second World War. With the help of the falsified protocols of the wise men of Zion, he incited himself and the German population against the Jews, finding particularly diligent supporters for his anti-Jewish propaganda among those who glorified him and with whom he was able to build up the Nazi system. And it is a fact that Adolf Hitler's plans for world conquest, which were criminal to humanity, were only discovered through the wrong protocols, with the old Thule Society supporting him in his mania for war and world domination. Only through this it was also possible, against false chroniclers and false factual experts in the matter of Adolf Hitler, etc., that this fanatical and insane criminal of humanity could lead the world into the Second World War and the Holocaust. But fanatics and lunatics in the matter of Jew hatred existed and exist in many countries on earth, whereby nowadays especially the neo-Nazis in Germany, Russia, and the USA have to be mentioned. But even before the Second World War, the USA made a big name for itself in terms of hatred of Jews as a result of the book of the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion, whereby the automobile giant Henry Ford stood out in particular, who had malicious and hateful inflammatory writings against Judaism printed in huge editions and spread them everywhere. Hitler, of course, did not remain unaware of this activity, although it is worth noting that the hatred of Jews did not find such good ground to flourish in the USA as it did in Germany. It was only after the Second World War that the great neo-Nazi movement emerged in the USA, nationwide and in various groups. Hitler took a liking to Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. Just as many conspiracy theorists, neo-Nazis, and other right-wing extremists of all kinds still have anti-Semitic tendencies today and live them out in an incredibly deep hatred of Jews.
Again and again, there are TV broadcasts about whether it can be proven that Hitler really committed suicide, and therefore is really dead. You have already explained earlier that this crime against humanity really did commit suicide together with his wife Eva Braun, and is not a fugitive from Berlin to Argentina or the South Pole, as conspiracy theorists have been claiming since the 1940s. So in 1945, the Russians actually found the burnt bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun above the leadership bunker in Berlin, but not the bodies of doppelgangers as is claimed. That is one thing, while the other question is whether or not children were born out of the relationship between Hitler and Eva Braun. Conspiracy theorists claim that the two of them fathered at least 2 children who were taken to safety somewhere in Norway.
Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun undoubtedly killed themselves, were then doused with petrol and burned beyond recognition. The Russian military then also found the remains of the two and secured them. But as far as the children are concerned, who according to conspiracy theorists were conceived by Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun and brought to safety in Norway, this is not true. The two of them did not sire any offspring. Hitler himself was severely ill with syphilis, was addicted to Pervitin, suffered from Parkinson's syndrome, chronic conjunctivitis, as well as intestinal inflammation and very bad teeth. And in addition, he was delusionally damaged in consciousness. He was constantly under strong drug influence, as he was constantly using against 100 different drugs, of which various painkillers, nerve poisons, and also prohibited substances. Just on the basis of these facts alone, the question is how this man should have fathered offspring.
One must indeed ask oneself that. But can you explain to me what the Pervitin addiction is all about? What is Pervitin?
It is an amphetamine that many addicts still use today, although the current name is known as the party drug meth.
Contact Report 616.
I can still hear your father's voice in my memory today, when he told me that Hitler was a liar, a criminal of humanity, a psychopath and a perfect actor, who also suffered from megalomania, which he dictatorially implemented from the very beginning of his power through his degenerated destructive instinct. No matter that he had to go over millions of corpses and tremendous destruction. Furthermore, Svath said, Hitler was extremely cowardly and shot himself out of life when the time came for him to face accountability. That by this he meant Hitler's suicide. I actually understood that, but only realized it later, when he actually shot himself. I remember that your father also said that Hitler had fallen prey to a degenerated mania of annihilation and destruction that had arisen in him at the beginning of his puberty, between the ages of 10 and 12. The reason for this was because his father mistreated him and physically maltreated him, but also demolished him psychologically. His mother was also to blame, for she had been mentally ill and had therefore raised Adolf Hitler wrongly from her side. Hitler simply let himself go, and he did not try to get a good education for himself, said Svath, because he had truly alienated himself from his parents, and with regard to all the things that had an effect on him, he had never sought blame on himself, but always only on others. So, your father said, Adolf Hitler saw himself in his childhood and youth as a victim of others and his environment, by which he also apologized for his constant failure, but swore that he would take revenge on all the human beings if he ever gained power. As a psychopath, Hitler, on the other hand, contrary to the fact that he constantly saw himself as the victim of others, was fully aware that through his suggestive speeches he could seduce his fellow men and bring them to his side, which he also used abundantly to gain advantages and power over others, which ultimately led to him establishing the Nazi system in Germany and being elevated to the status of leader. Truthfully, Hitler also had a death instinct, as Svath said, which not only related to himself, but also resulted in the death mania of countless other people and the boundless destructive rage. And by this far-reaching madness, he could also instill hatred into the German people, and all those people who have attached hatred to him and his fanatical and radical speeches, who spoke after his madness and put everything into action in the worst way possible. He was as suggestive in his speeches as many other people are who suggestively rake their fellow men with fanatical and radical utterances, allegations, lies, speeches, and slander, and make them commit murders, develop hatred against whole groups and peoples as well as races, religions, and sects.
Contact Report 662.
The consciousness-ill and megalomaniac Adolf Hitler, who was God-fearing and Bible-loyal and also an eighth-part Jew, saw himself as a Messiah who wanted to fulfill the prophecies of the New Testament on behalf and in the name of God, and thereby also support the Christian churches.
Contact Report 672. 20th Century Agent Theory. Adolf Hitler's actions had been guided by the economy. False. Contact Report 676.
Recently there was once again a visitor here, who unfortunately is unteachably following conspiracy theories, and of course does not allow himself to be taught any better, as is so usual. This time it was about that our visitor service was covered with the old nonsense of the adventurous Schwachsinn theory, which claims that the corpses of Hitler and Eva Braun had been brought after their suicide on the 30th of April, 1945, on a secret submarine with the designation U-977 into a Nazi bunker in Antarctica, which was also secret. Their clone experiments are said to have been carried out in order to save the genes of the leader and to resurrect him as a clone. So, in this respect, secret research is said to have been done and to continue to be done, which of course awakened crazy rumors that Hitler and his Eve were alleged to be sleeping deep under Antarctica. Keywords like Hitler in Antarctica or Russian researchers have drilled Lake Vostok in Antarctica can be found everywhere on the internet. The underwater world, untouched for millions of years, not only promises an unknown ecosystem, but also awakens memories of the Nazi leader Hitler. For in Russia there are crazy rumors circulating about a Hitler clone station in the Antarctic, for which the question is asked, are Hitler and his beloved buried there? But what has to do with the subglacial Lake Vostok is the fact that a Russian Antarctic research team has reached the surface of Lake Vostok with a special drill at a depth of 69.30 meters, which corresponds to a great scientific success of Antarctic research. According to the ITAR TASS agency, this was communicated by the Ministry of Natural Resources and disseminated worldwide. But this successful Antarctic research now also leads to the fact that at the same time the rumors are boiling up again regarding Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, who married this mankind criminal before the suicide, whose corpses were taken after the suicide to a secret Nazi bunker in Antarctica near Lake Vostok, according to idiotic rumors, in order to allegedly carry out clone experiments there. The stupid conspiracy theory claims that the Nazi leader ordered the construction of 2 underground bases in Antarctica to begin as early as 1940. But the whole conspiracy theater goes even further, because some time ago it was possible to read, for example, in the British Sun about a New Berlin of the Nazis, because some time ago Russian researchers found remains of a Nazi research station in the Arctic, which was built 600 kilometers away from the North Pole. But why this was not also at the South Pole, that is to say, in the Antarctic or on the backside of the Moon, where the Nazis, according to conspiracy theories, are also supposed to have been, that is just as strange as that once more the mysterious Atlantis, as well as the Illuminati, are used and associated with a Hitler Nazi bunker cloning station, as any extraterrestrials are associated with an alien Antarctic station or a giant asteroid. To all this I have searched the internet and found something on Wikipedia, which I present to you here, if you want to read it please, because it also has some interesting things. Of course I already know from your father Svath what happened to Hitler and his wife, and that the Nazis were also briefly in Antarctica. As I also know about the misguided conspiracy theory, but I would like to hear briefly what you have to say about it.
I know the absurdity of this conspiracy theory, as well as what you have just said, but I will not fail to read what you have copied from the internet. Article duplicated in Contact Report 676. What you have here copied from Wikipedia corresponds to the effective facts as they are contained in my father's annals. Accordingly, I can confirm that the information given in these documents is correct in relation to the conspiracy theory, as well as in relation to the research findings and clarifications of Summerhays, etc., which cannot be doubted.
Contact Report 709.
The death rune, as well as others, has its origin in the Germanic culture, like Odin, that is to say Wotan, and Thor, that is to say Donar. For centuries, the mysterious inscriptions have inspired the imagination of so-called scientists and laymen, as they also do in modern myths. Nowadays, especially in Europe but also all over the world, runes are associated with Nazis and neo-Nazis, and partly rightly so because in the Third Reich, dictator Adolf Hitler ran a cult around the runes. But the fact is that even today, more than 70 years after the Third World War of 1939 to 1945, the rune of death and other runes are used as a sign of recognition by many mad imitators of the former Nazis, who stupidly out themselves as young Nazis. The harmful and disastrous false peace sign, which falsely and peace-destroyingly represents an upside-down tree of life, is extremely popular in the left-wing scene and among peace activists. However, these ignorant, uneducated people who are misled with regard to the false peace symbol are not aware, and to this day are not aware, that they are promoting harm, discord, war, murder, and manslaughter with this false symbol. The false peace symbol, which is effectively a death sign, became popular through the hippies, who made it a trademark for themselves. The rune symbol is effectively a rune that does not mean peace, but death and destruction. Almost nobody knows that the peace sign, which is used worldwide, is actually a rune and the symbol of death. As a peace sign, the rune should stylize life, so the symbol should represent a tree growing upwards, which effectively symbolizes life or the beginning of life. The inverted tree of life, however, as depicted in the false peace symbol, stands for death and the end of life.
Contact Report 733.
I just want to say that the idiotic conspiracy theories are absolute nonsense, that Hitler and his Eva fled to Argentina. There must have been a Hitler look-alike and an Eva look-alike who were built up as Hitler and Eva Braun during years of hard training in the 1930s, and consequently both became so perfect in their roles that the uninitiated could not tell the difference between them and the real thing. Only the two closest confidants around Hitler knew the truth, for all those involved in building up and training the two doubles were liquidated. These doubles were also provided with false papers in the names of Hitler and his Eva Braun, just as they were given false papers and fled to Argentina when the Soviets attacked, while Hitler himself and his wife Eva holed up in the Führer bunker in Berlin and really blessed their time. The lie, however, is that the criminal killed himself and his wife because he was too cowardly to do so, so he and Eva Braun were shot by two fanatics who listened to him, which was then presented as suicide and also recorded as such. Hitler himself was really too cowardly to shoot his Eva and commit suicide, after which the two executioners, loyal and completely obedient to Hitler until death, killed him and his Eva Braun on the 30th of April 1945 at 1533 HRs with 2 shots to the head. The two Hitler confidants had already held discussions about this days before, during which the two Hitler fanatics swore to draw up false, lying protocols, just as the two Hitler fanatics also vowed to maintain silence about everything until their deaths, and to let Hitler continue to exist as an allegedly courageous suicide hero, even after his death. This explains from the point of view of reality how it actually happened and what actually happened, completely different from the lying and falsified protocols and the later statements of the two murderers. It should now be clear, even without this matter, that Eva Braun and Hitler were not shot by two of his fanatical followers on his orders, because the scumbag was too cowardly to judge himself, and therefore two of his followers took matters into their own hands in order to save him from capture by the Soviets, and from their brutality, etc. It is to be regretted that Eva Braun and Hitler were not shot by the Soviets, because the scumbag was too cowardly to judge himself. Eva Braun was to be pitied here, who was horrified when the two Hitler confidants appeared, and announced to them that the Soviets were approaching, and also explained what they were now going to do, and then also shot without further ado with their pistols, which they already had in their hands when they entered, so that Hitler and Eva Braun, or Hitler, could not even say anything back. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had also surrounded themselves with 2 pairs of doppelgangers, which was largely concealed and thus kept secret, as was the fact that they sometimes came to the fore while Hitler or Eva Braun were elsewhere in safety. One of the 2 pairs of doppelgangers was so similar to the originals that no differences could be discerned, so to speak, also with regard to the way of speaking, the movements, the behavior and mannerisms. Therefore, during certain appearances, not even Hitler's direct staff noticed that Hitler pushed his practically perfect doppelganger forward when an appearance seemed too risky. Also, there were never any suspicions, etc., because only his 2 fanatics knew about the whole thing, who then shot Hitler and his wife, who was finally married to him, so that they would not fall into Russian captivity, of which Hitler was hellishly afraid. The two fanatics were then practically the executioners who executed Hitler and Eva Braun, because Hitler was too cowardly to do so, although he had been proclaiming for some time that he would kill himself if everything went wrong. But when the time came that his delusion of world domination did not come true, he broke down psychologically and staggered around in the bunker like a sad heap of misery. And then, full of miserable fear and cowardice, he hid in the bunker with his wife, whereupon the two fanatics who had listened to him joined forces and decided to kill their boss and his wife before the Russians could get hold of him, the man obsessed with world domination. So the two conspirators went into the room of Hitler and Eva Braun, where they both sat on a couch and were murdered. First, Hitler was shot by his personal aide-de-camp and body servant, and then, a few seconds later, Eva Braun, who was Mrs. But the two executioners concealed this all their lives and, moreover, falsified this fact mendaciously, because they knew very well that they would have been made to pay for it, and would also have been shot away from the present by Hitler's SS killer comrades of the bunker crew, etc., even after the war by neo-Nazis and other Hitler fanatics. And since they remained silent, it never became known what really happened at that time. So nothing of these secret events ever reached the public, just as nothing ever reached the ears of the Russians and Americans. And the two executioners were able to keep this secret all their lives. Well, actually, I wanted to say something more about the Hitler affair, namely that the Hitlerian look-alike couple, who had been cut out of Hitler's and Eva Braun's faces, bodies, language and manner of speaking, as well as their movements, mannerisms, and behavior, fled to Argentina, where more than 18,000 Nazi henchmen had also fled. Svath explained that, years before the World War, the doppelganger couple had secretly rehearsed and learned Hitler's movements, speeches, behavior, etc., so that they could perform in Hitler's manner without being bothered. Thus, this Hitler-Eva Braun look-alike couple also acted as doubles in the Reich for photographs and films, such as private life recordings, which were also distributed as real Hitler-Eva Braun films and as real Hitler-Eva Braun photos, thus deceiving the Reich people and the world.
Contact Report 779.
If the Nazi researchers who were working on it, a secret invention of Nikola Tesla at the time, had been able to complete the invention entirely, and before Hitler, together with his wife, who had married him shortly before, was shot by his servants in his bunker in Berlin, then he would have become the ruler of the world with this weapon.
Contact Report 786.
The state powers and the people who agree to everything have learned nothing from the Nazi methods of the last World War, because they are doing exactly the same as the Nazis did. They are applying the same and very vicious and freedom-robbing coercive methods to the people as the Nazis already did, namely that those human beings will be punished who will not submit to the freedom-robbing coercive measures. It is strange, even the Nazi leader at that time, Adolf Hitler, came from Austria. Although he was born in Braunau am Inn on the 20th of April 1889, I know that he actually began his life in Vienna. In Germany, however, he then carried out his degenerate actions and behavior and led earthly humanity into the catastrophe of the World War. He did this with the help of the people cheering him on, who, believing in him, thoughtlessly went along with the whole disaster, which ultimately claimed millions of human lives. The non-self-thinking of the majority of the people, that is to say stupidity, was unfortunately as widespread as it still is today. And with regard to the announced compulsory vaccination, this equally results in what had led to the world war at that time and had ignored that minority which had actually thought for itself, and consequently was against what the majority thoughtlessly and as stupid followers believed this Adolf Hitler, as well as followed his henchmen.
Contact Report 813.
Hitler did the same thing with Pervitin, just in a different way. Mankind, however, knows nothing about it, because everything is concealed from it. Also what and who Hitler, whose real name was Hiedler, really was, that was and still is, stubbornly concealed.
That is indeed the case. He was not only a substance abuser as well as a drug addict, but really a nobody by origin, who was also incestuously conceived by his father with his own daughter, who was therefore Hitler's sister. Moreover, he was not only mentally ill since childhood, but also suffered from episodic schizophrenia.
Contact Report 827.
Although he was not even German, but Austrian, the Germans listened to this guy like well-behaved, obedient dogs, as a result of which millions of Jews were murdered and around 60 million human beings perished in general. Hitler, however, apparently grabbed the word from the protocols of the elders of Zion and made use of it, namely, the people's awe of might. Our firmly established might will hold the reins of government tightly in its hand and not run after party leaders and orators who proclaim unrealizable reveries with great verbosity. It will guarantee complete peace and order, which is the whole happiness of human beings. The people will fall on their knees before the radiant wreath of our might and look up to it in shy reverence. True might does not avail itself of a single right, not even the divine. No one will dare to tread too close to it and curtail its fullness of power even by a hair's breadth. Now, the fact that Adolf Hitler made use of this from the protocols of the wise men of Zion, but contrary to this in his book Mein Kampf, you can see it here. For example, on these pages 211 and 212, cursed and executed about the Jews, this contradicts itself and proves that this guy was not in his right mind. Moreover, at the same time he indulged in the delusion that the Aryans were the founders of culture on this earth. As he notes on page 321, true founders of culture on this earth, the Aryans themselves.
Adolf Hitler was very badly damaged in terms of consciousness, and that from birth.
Contact Report 831.
Adolf Hitler, who was not even German but actually Austrian.
Contact Report 844.
Adolf Hitler, who was Austrian, but who was then a Nazi dictator in Germany, who failed in secondary schools and was called Schicklgruber as an illegitimate, but who took his father Hitler's name at the age of 40.
Contact Report 855.
I have something for you to look at in a moment, because a certain Joseph writes that the whole thing is a contradiction, because I said that Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Obviously, people do not think enough themselves, and therefore do not understand correctly, precisely because they lack their own power of thought. Therefore they do not think enough and correctly themselves, and therefore do not understand that certain statements have several meanings, and must also be understood in a broader sense. Billy's note. It was obviously also explained to Bernadette in this manner in an email, as she later told me in the kitchen. Thus, when the suicide of Hitler and Eva Braun was first discussed, it was only said that they had liquidated themselves, although it was not said how this suicide took place. At that time and for the following decades, much was only assumed and therefore not clear, which meant that on the one hand, various versions were mentioned, but what really happened only emerged later or was corrected. This is precisely how it came about, what constantly happens on Earth, that different versions emerged until finally everything became clear, and that only through a return journey. So the following was said in the beginning note, Billy. Question to Christian, who says that Joseph is a man who translates contact reports. Third stage, which meant that his consciousness was already no longer completely clear in his head. His consciousness was already partially impaired, which meant that he was no longer able to think and act clearly, and also became megalomaniac and unpredictable. He would have died sooner or later from this disease, syphilis, if he hadn't shot himself, which he actually did, didn't he? At any rate, that is what Svath said. Then there was further talk. how this mass murderer killed himself. Do you know anything about that? It is always claimed that he poisoned himself, while others claim that he fled to Spain or South America. Then once Urlana brought a version of an earthly rumor.
These concerns belong to my knowledge. Adolf Hitler, fearing that his suicide might fail, deprived himself of his life in two processes. For first, he ingested a cyanide capsule, which he bit and swallowed, and then immediately put a handgun in his mouth and shot himself in the brain with it, the bullet then exiting from the side of the back of his head. His remains were secretly buried by the Russians in East Germany, where, however, they were dug up again in 1975 and thrown away so that no neo-Nazi cult site could be created. Parts of the skull and dentition were brought to Russia, where they are still kept today. With this, I have said the most important things in a short process. This knowledge of Urlana was then investigated, and it was explored that she had taken this knowledge from a religious writing of a sectarian, which was written by a eugenicist named Schlapphoff as a template. Then finally the following was explained by me, which was based on a review arranged by Svath before he left Earth forever.
Conspiracy theories are absolute nonsense that Hitler and his Eva fled to Argentina. There must have been a Hitler look-alike and an Eva look-alike who were built up as Hitler and Eva Braun during years of hard training in the 1930s, and consequently both became so perfect in their roles that the uninitiated could not tell the difference between them and the real thing. Only the two closest confidants around Hitler knew the truth, for all those involved in building up and training the two doubles were liquidated. These doubles were also provided with false papers in the names of Hitler and his Eva Braun, just as they were given false papers and fled to Argentina when the Soviets attacked, while Hitler himself and his wife Eva holed up in the Führer bunker in Berlin and really blessed their time. The lie, however, is that the criminal killed himself and his wife because he was too cowardly to do so. So he and Eva Braun were shot by two fanatics who listened to him, which was then presented as suicide and also recorded as such. Hitler himself was really too cowardly to shoot his Eva and commit suicide, after which the two executioners, loyal and completely obedient to Hitler until death, killed him and Eva Braun on the 30th of April 1945 at 15:33 HRs with 2 shots to the head. The two Hitler fanatics swore to each other that they would draw up false, lying protocols, just as the two Hitler fanatics also swore to each other that they would maintain silence about everything until their deaths, and that Hitler would continue to exist as a supposedly courageous suicide hero, even after his death. This explains from the point of view of reality how it actually happened and what was actually the case, completely different from what the two murderers lied about in the false and falsified protocols and later statements. That was what happened with regard to the suicide of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. Hitler was a coward, and something different from what is generally still claimed today by right-wing extremists and other Hitler fanatics, that is to say, Nazis or neo-Nazis, who glorify him as a great man. He was in fact only a coward, and in such a way that he was in fact only a pitiful figure incapable of life. Consequently, he could only appear great and strong to the outside world, because his fellow men blindly and thoughtlessly believed his fanatical speeches, and consequently paid him stupid homage. It is also to be said that in addition to the couple who doubled Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, there was a second doubled couple, but they were murdered by those who also shot Hitler and Eva Braun shortly after they were both dead.